Putting together a parts list for a PC can be kind of an overwhelming feeling, especially if you haven't done this a lot, or even if you've done it before. Maybe it was like 8 years ago. I'm a high school teacher in addition to running the channel, and by this point, most of my students are aware that I have the channel, and so sometimes they'll ask me about this, and oftentimes I'll need to kind of just take them through this process where you think through the individual selections. So I realized, you know what, when I had a student ask me about this after school about 2 days ago, I was like, you know what, I should probably do another one of these videos where we talk through the process of choosing parts for your PC. Now, I'm going to talk through choosing new parts, but oftentimes the best deals are actually on the used market, and Jawa.gg is an amazing place to look. Now, they've sponsored today's video, and if you haven't heard of Jawa, this is where you buy, sell, and upgrade between gamers. There's a lot of great options here. Now, one option is to actually just buy a completed system. Now, today's video talking through the parts will also help you decide if an already built system makes sense and if it's a good value. And again, oftentimes these used deals are going to fit lower budget ranges than what you can really build new and be comfortable with, which is awesome, and you can get some great deals. Now, Jawa makes it easy to find what you're looking for by just saying, look, this is my budget, here's a game I want to play, here's the performance I want, here's my monitor resolution, and it'll pop up some options in that range. You can also shop by theme to make sure it's going to match your style for your room. But you can also, of course, buy individual components. You can also fund your upgrade by selling your old hardware. Now, you could become a seller on Jawa, create your own listings, set your own prices, or if you're looking for maximum convenience, Jawa will actually buy GPUs and CPUs directly from you, and you can get an instant offer by clicking this Get an Instant Offer button. Also, I can save you $10 off your first purchase using code OWEN10. And again, you can follow the sponsored link in the video description and or pinned comment to get there. Now, there's tons of great reviews for Jawa. They have a Discord community with tons of members, so definitely check out this resource. And I'll be giving a lot of other great resources to use today for this whole PC building process. Now, let's check out if you're planning out the build or deciding if a build is good. The main components that affect gaming performance are the CPU and the GPU, which is also called the video card. Technically, the GPU is the graphics processor that's on the card, which also has like a cooler and stuff. So GPU and video card can be sometimes used kind of interchangeably and are mostly talking about the same part in the computer. Now, one of the biggest choices you make for your actual computer build itself is the CPU, because the CPU will only fit into a certain motherboard. And if you're trying to upgrade an older system, that's the real important thing to know, is that you can't just buy a new CPU and plug it into an old motherboard without checking if it fits. Now, the latest motherboard platform from AMD can actually have several generations of parts. And if you go back to the last generation of motherboard, there's lots of generations of CPUs that fit into that. And generally, that's one of the reasons why I'm going to steer towards the AMD platforms right now, because they're known to have a lot of upgradability on it. Now, the latest and biggest AMD CPU is the Ryzen 9 9950X3D. But this has tons of cores and threads, and for gaming, you don't necessarily need that. For gaming, 6 cores is pretty much fine. 8 might be nice to have, and more than that is really unnecessary if your use case is gaming. Now, for the latest gaming CPU, the most powerful one is the 9800X3D. In certain games, sometimes certain Intel CPUs will be faster, but on average, most reviewers have the 9800X3D as the fastest one. But you don't need to get a 9800X3D to really max out your gaming performance anyway, because it's important to understand how your CPU and your video card kind of both contribute to your gaming performance. Generally, your game is going to run at a certain number of frames per second. And it's going to be limited by either how fast the CPU can process those frames or the graphics card. Now, if you buy way too weak of a CPU, or if you try to put a brand new GPU into a really old CPU platform, then you might kind of waste some of the potential of your graphics card, because the CPU can't feed it information fast enough. But if you're buying a new system with a new CPU and a new GPU, you're actually more likely to be GPU limited than CPU limited in most situations. So really with the CPU, you need to buy one that's good enough to keep up with your graphics card, but you don't need to go crazy overkill on this unless you have the budget to do so. So I would say that for most people where budget is a pretty meaningful concern, should start their build by going with one of the least expensive CPUs that still fit onto AMD's latest platform. So this would be the, I'll type in the Ryzen, a Ryzen 5 7600 or 7600X in the United States. Now, in some regions, you can go as low as like a 7400F or a 7500. There's things like that. But those don't generally tend to be available in the United States at major retailers. That's why I'm focusing on the 7600 as kind of our bottom end here. Now, these are currently $170. Now, there's a newer generation, these 9600, which is slightly faster, but only slightly. Looks like that one's coming in at $196, so it's a little more money for a little more performance. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and slot in the less expensive one. And we'll look at later, if you have budget for it, then you could consider a higher end CPU. But I think it's important to not go over budget, to first look at what's a really conservative budget build. And then if you have extra money to throw at the PC, where would you put it to get the most bang for the buck? So what we're going to be looking at here is an absolutely bare bones build, but on the latest platform. So also there's like the 7600X or the 7600. These are essentially the same thing for all meaningful purposes, other than slight clock speed differences, which can have slight performance differences. There's slight power differences, but the overall gaming performance on these is going to be almost identical, so it makes sense to get the less expensive option. Although sometimes the 7600 non-X comes with a box cooler, although I've seen some talk about AMD maybe not always offering that this time, so I'd look at the listing closely now to be sure on that. Now, I'm going to go with the 7600X since it clocks slightly higher and also costs less money in the United States. But if you had this one was less money, or if you looked at the 9600 in your region or on the date you're buying it and it was about the same price or less price, go with that. These all, the 7600s and the 9600s, X and non-Xs, all have very similar gaming performance. And to back that up, let's talk about some resources you can use. So if you look up one of the latest CPU reviews, and you look at the gaming performance, not the application performance, because that's very different. That can use lots and lots of cores. Gaming doesn't usually use as many cores. So if you look at the gaming performance, then we'll notice things that kind of back up what I'm saying here. The 7600X is very slightly faster than the 7600. We're talking like average gaming performance here, only shifting very slightly. Here we're looking at like 170.5 FPS in this particular suite of games versus 173.2. You're not going to notice that difference, right? And then the 9600X, 177.5. Again, it's a very slight difference. Then you have the 8-core parts, like the 7700X, 175.9 FPS. The 9700X, 178.4 FPS. We're talking very small differences. And this is talking about CPU limited performance, where you're on a super high-end graphics card at a low resolution, so you're more likely to be running into your CPU's limit than your GPU's limit, which is the right way to test CPUs, but it can confuse people. Because if you put in like a 9800X 3D, but you have a GPU that's limiting your performance anyway, you're not really going to see a lot of benefits. Now, this is slightly oversimplifying it, because it's true that certain games are going to be more CPU limited than others, or certain moments or scenes or areas within a particular game could be more CPU limited than others. But in general, something like a 7600 or a 9600 is going to get you the full performance in most situations and most games out of most mid-range reasonable graphics cards. We'll talk about if you have more money later in this video. So that's why I'm going to go ahead and slot in the 7600X. Now, you also need to choose a motherboard that is compatible with this. Now, when I go to motherboards, I'm using PC Part Picker right now. And once you've slotted in the CPU, you can sort prices low to high, and it's now only going to show you motherboards that are compatible with the CPU that you've selected. Now, that being said, how do you distinguish between motherboards and which one would make sense to go with? Well, there's different chipsets. For example, there's A620, B650, there's B850, there's the 800 series, if we start going down here, B850s. Now, all of these have some differences in terms of like the number of like memory slots they might support, how fast you can clock that memory, how many USB ports they offer, how many SSD slots do they offer, do the motherboards come with built-in Wi-Fi? And some of those aren't even based on whether it's like an A620 or a B650, they're just based on the particular motherboard. So I think a place that a lot of people way overspend is on the motherboard, especially if you're not putting in some gigantic CPU with like 16 or more cores that uses lots of energy and you're planning on overclocking and all of that. If we're using a part like a 7600X, almost any motherboard can run it to its full potential. Now, you can also think about if in the future you'd want to upgrade to a bigger one and all of that. But I think in general, if you get a B650 motherboard, think about whether you want Wi-Fi or not. That should depend on if you can get an Ethernet port to your computer that can plug directly in to your router. That's going to be a better internet connection than using Wi-Fi. But if due to wherever your router is located and like where your PC is located, if you can't get an Ethernet port there, then that's where maybe getting Wi-Fi built into the motherboard is useful. But you can also buy, Wi-Fi adapters and things like that, or you could look into like a mesh network where you could then get a Wi-Fi mesh router near your PC and then plug in directly to that with Ethernet. There's a lot of options on that, but it is something to consider. So really, I think a lot of people overthink or overspend on the motherboard choices. So if you want something with Wi-Fi, you could get that, but don't completely overspend. That being said, not all motherboards are created equal. If you run a super high-end CPU with a lot of power draw in a motherboard that doesn't have real great power delivery or real great thermals, then you can run into some issues. So one thing to look at is places like Hardware Unboxed, and I think they also publish their articles on TechSpot, will do motherboard reviews. So if I go ahead and search like TechSpot review, that'll have the Hardware Unbox information, but in text-based format, and I search up one of these motherboards, there's a good chance that they've reviewed it. And then you can kind of get an idea of how it stacks up against other ones. Because if I'm looking at something like this ASRock B850M Pro with Wi-Fi, I might want to go ahead and search for that and see if that shows up on a, like I said, on a review roundup that we've seen from the B850 motherboards. So you can get to this, and then you can get there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. You can Control F on the articles like this and try to put in the motherboard you're looking for. If the entire name isn't showing up, maybe the Wi-Fi part doesn't show up, so we could look at the B850 Pro A. You can look at that, right? So that looks like it showed up in this motherboard roundup, and then you can go ahead and search for kind of what they have to say about this. Also, if you scroll down far enough, they are going to have some graphs where what you're looking at here is things like the temperature the CPU was running at, and or like the VRM temperatures, the score it was able to get. And what you're mainly looking at is that it's not like a complete disaster, right? So here we're looking at the B850M. so it was the B850M Pro A from ASRock. So B850M Pro A. It's looking like the Cinebench results here are doing just fine. You're not seeing it like kind of falling off compared to some of these other ones. They do some other tests like how long is the boot times. Looks like it has one of the lower boot times. So overall, there's nothing to be too like concerned about here for its overall performance and boot times, things like that. So as long as it has all of the ports that you need, you're probably good. Except I will mention, just kind of an offhand comment, sometimes there'll be some kind of drama or issue going on in the PC space that you won't really find out about if you haven't been monitoring it. Right now, ASRock motherboards from their 800 series have been having a bit of a reputation for frying 9800X3D CPUs. Now, with that in mind, I think that's one of the reasons why they have good prices right now, and they don't have a reputation of frying a 7600X. It's the 9800X3Ds for whatever reason. Now, they've also given a lot of BIOS updates, which have probably helped with that, but I haven't seen a definitive answer that they've completely solved the problem. So I'm going to say that if you are pairing this motherboard with the 9800X3D, I might look at a different brand besides ASRock. But for the purposes of this build, this reviewed really well and is a good price. So I'm going to go ahead and slot this in. But yeah, there is some controversy right now over 9800X3D CPUs in ASRock motherboards. So caution if that's the CPU that you're going to be going for here. But we're looking at a more value-oriented build, and hopefully if you were ever going to upgrade to that in the future, ASRock will have had a BIOS update that would handle that. Anyway, so now we also need to think about the memory or the RAM. So so that's also called RAM. So memory, RAM. Now this basically for a current generation build, you would like to have 32 gigabytes in two 16 gigabyte sticks. However, if you want an ultra budget, I mean, most games are still playable on 16 gigabytes of system RAM, but I've got to say that RAM's not so expensive that I wouldn't recommend getting 32 gigabytes unless you're on an ultra budget build. And 32 gigabytes shows no sign of being, falling short anytime soon. So 32 gigabytes should be completely fine in two 16 gigabyte sticks. There can be advantages to having two sticks instead of one. Now, as far as the speeds go, the sweet spot for AMD systems right now is 6,000. So I'm going to up the speeds here to 6,000. And then for CAS latency, I've noticed that 30 tends to be a pretty good kind of price to performance option. So for CAS latency, lower is better, and for the speed, higher is better. But going much higher, you start to get out of sync with the fabric, it's stuff you don't need to think about. Really, 6,000 CL30 is usually a pretty good option here, but let's look at what the pricing's like today. So we're sorting prices low to high. You can get two 16 gigabyte sticks of DDR5 6000 CL34 for $100. Let's see how much more it would cost to get down to CL30. Now, oh wow, actually it's significantly more right now. That's interesting. So I had heard, but hadn't kept up with, that actually memory pricing has gone up a lot recently. That seems to be the case. So here's the thing, CL34, not gonna be a lot slower than CL30. And because it looks like memory pricing isn't great right now, I'm actually thinking it might not be worth the extra $40 right now to get to that lower latency. Looks like we've got a CL32 option for $133. But yeah, given that we could get a CL34 option at $100 right now, I think it actually makes sense to go with the slower RAM. It's not much slower. And remember, you're only really going to be seeing that performance difference when you are CPU limited. And in most gaming situations, you're likely to be GPU limited when pairing a modern CPU with a mid-range GPU. That's going to be the typical case. In which case, we're saving like $40 right now by not, and we'll very rarely notice the difference. That's the idea on that. So we want to spend the money where we're more likely to notice the difference, which is the graphics card. Now, CPUs sometimes will come with a boxed cooler, which will get the job done, but can sometimes be kind of noisy. But this particular one doesn't come with a boxed cooler. So you can get a CPU cooler. And this is another place where I notice that people spend way too much money. I see people buying these like, NZXT Kraken 360. It's $180. So first of all, almost every AMD CPU is fairly low wattage, which means, and especially the one we're getting here, it is not hard to cool. So if you were thinking about going like the super high-end Intel CPU route, those can, especially if you're overclocking it, those can sometimes be really hard to keep cool. But if you're getting something like a 7600X, almost any CPU cooler will do the job. If it, like almost anything. And honestly, air coolers that don't have the so there's two different cooler styles. Let's talk about that again. We're kind of in a very basics video, like basics being explained here. So an air cooler just sticks right on top of the CPU on the motherboard, and it has fans, and it'll blow the heat out of the CPU and keep it cool, and then that'll exit through the fans on the back of your case. The other style is an all-in-one water cooler. This has a little metal plug kind of thing that'll sit on top of the CPU on the motherboard, and then it'll run a coolant across that. Like water goes through that takes the heat, and then it'll blow it across a fan. But these fans attach to your case and then directly blow the air out of the case rather than blowing the air through the inside of the case. That being said, oftentimes the water coolers are more expensive than an air cooler, and also they can have a higher failure rate and not last as long. Although that's not a major issue, that is also something to think about. So really, I would say that the Thermalright Peerless Assassin 120 here at $35 is absolutely going to cool the CPU completely fine. Now, if for aesthetic reasons you want some like RGB lights and stuff, hey, there's a Thermalright air cooler here for $55 that is absolutely going to cool your CPU just fine. What I don't think you need is to spend a lot more money than that. Now, also, if you want like the air cooler option, but with RGB lighting, you could spend an extra $3 and get RGB lighting. Now, honestly, you could probably even go crazy inexpensive with like this $18 cooler and not have a lot of options on something like the 7600X, not have a lot of issues. One thought if you're getting these bigger air coolers, the all-in-one coolers, is that those fans do need to fit onto your case. So you need to make sure that there's room for the size of radiator. That's what it's called when you check your case. Now, if you're buying these air coolers, sometimes the RAM slots will be kind of close to the CPU. And if you have a big air cooler, sometimes if the RAM is really tall, you could run into some clearance issues on that. So if you're buying these air coolers, you want to check on where is the RAM and is it gonna have enough clearance on that. And if you're buying these all-in-one coolers, you have to make sure that your case has a spot where you can fit the size of radiator that you're putting on it. You know what? Since a lot of people like the pretty lights, and this is only $55, I think I'm going to go ahead and slot this one in. Oh, should I? You know what? Let's go with the more value-oriented build. So we're going to go with this one. I don't really like all the RGB lights, so I'm going to go with the black one. Okay, you could spend $3 more and get that. So I'm going to go ahead and slot this in. But again, if you want the light up fans and all that and the all-in-one look, great, go with that. 20 extra bucks, it's not going to help your gaming performance. But it might look cool, which is part of building the PC. So something to think about. Okay, now the most important option besides the CPU, which we now have all up and running here, is the video card. However, that being said, so much of that is going to depend on your budget that I think a helpful idea is to put together the rest of your PC kind of as inexpensively as possible, and then decide how much money do you have left in your budget to spend on your GPU. And essentially, every dollar spent there is going to bump up your gaming performance in a noticeable way. We'll talk about that in a second. But so to get an idea of how much GPU you can afford, let's go ahead and slot in some other stuff. So storage, this would be your SSD. Please don't buy a hard disk drive, because if we just sort prices low to high right now, like you're going to see some hard disk drives pop up. So at least, sort for an SSD. But also with SSDs, there's different types. So there's SATA SSDs. These are kind of the older ones. And then there's the NVMe drives. These will slot directly into the motherboard unless you have a really old system before those slots existed. Now, generally, the NVMe drives are faster, although certain ones, may individually not be super fast. But the thing is, for gaming, the speed of the SSD doesn't really matter in any meaningful way. This has been tested quite a bit. Even SATA SSDs generally load pretty quickly, and they do stream assets in the games fast enough to not really cause issues. Really, the speeds of the SSD aren't as important as its capacity and its price. So as far as capacity goes, that's like how much storage space. 1,000 gigabytes is roughly 1 terabyte. So if you hear about terabytes, that's roughly 1,000 gigabytes. So if we kind of adjust to around 1,000 or so and sort prices low to high, I would say you should buy at least 1 terabyte of storage space. The reason is that a lot of games now are really big. Some of them are well over 100 gigabytes of space on your drive. Which means that if you have a terabyte and then some of that gets eaten up by formatting and your operating system, so maybe you actually only have like 800 or so, you install just a few games and now there's very little space left on your PC, depending on the kinds of games that you play. I mean, if you have Call of Duty installed with several of the packages on that, it can easily be hundreds of gigabytes. So personally, I start to feel really cramped if I'm less than 1 terabyte, and I'm going to be 100% honest, personally, I would prefer 2 terabytes or even more. I mean, honestly, in my PC, because I do video editing, if you're planning on recording video, that's going to, and maybe editing video, video files, especially if you're recording at 4K or something like that, those will be absolutely huge amounts of storage space. So I have like multiple 8 terabyte SSDs. But again, I'm a content creator. So for just gaming, 1 terabyte's kind of the minimum I would go with. And then 2 terabytes would be better. You'll feel more comfortable. That being said, you can add more SSDs later. So you could start with 1 NVMe drive, and then if your motherboard has room for more NVMe slots, you could buy more NVMe drives. But if it doesn't, you could still buy SSD drives, like SATA SSDs, and add them to your computer later. And like I said, games don't really have issues on SATA SSDs. Hardware Unboxed did some testing fairly recently on that. Like, they still work fine. Like, you might get quicker load times, on the NVMe drive, but we're talking like a few seconds difference at most on a pretty long load time. So it's not really a big deal. That being said, I would recommend the NVMe drives. Now, there's PCIe 3.0 and 4.0 drives, and they can be different speeds and all of that. So you might as well look if they cost about the same at what you're getting. But in general, don't spend a lot more for a faster drive unless you really had some reason you needed it. And for gaming, I'm going to say it's not a real great reason to need it. So the least expensive one we have here is a PCIe 3.0 drive at $60. We can see here a PCIe 4.0 drive, which is not necessarily faster, but usually are a little bit faster for like $1 more. So, I mean, I might go with that. Here's another PCIe 4.0 option at $62. I'm gonna be honest, Crucial tends to me at least is a more well-known brand name than KingSpec. That doesn't always mean anything, but it might mean what sort of customer service you're dealing with. So I might just slot in this PCIe 4.0 Crucial drive for $62 and not overthink this. But yes, you absolutely could go into the weeds right now on looking up every single storage in roughly that same price category, maybe within about $10, and checking their read and write speeds and seeing if there's any major differences. You could absolutely do that. For the purposes of today's video, I'm just kind of putting together a general thought process, so I'm not going to overthink this. This will play games just fine, and it's about the cheapest NVMe option available that's at least 1 terabyte, so we're slotting that into the system. Now, the next thing we could think about is the case and power supply. The case is mostly an aesthetic choice as long as it's big enough to fit the length of your graphics card, and big enough to fit your motherboard. It just needs to be big enough to fit your parts. Really, that's all the case needs to be. I have some more thoughts on that in a second, but the power supply is a little bit more important. This needs to be enough wattage to power your GPU and your CPU and all of that. But right now, we can see that the watts, this is being tracked here, this is estimating us at about 214 watts, which is very little. Now, the graphics card is going to use some more watts. Now, depending on which one we choose, they could be anywhere in the range from around 100 watts if we're super low end, up to an RTX 5090, which is like 600 watts. But most graphics cards are going to be in the 100 to 300 watt range, which would put us into the 500 to 600 watts would be pretty safe. Now, having a little bit more headroom is nice, and also that allows for upgrades in the future. Maybe you want to buy a more power-hungry GPU and CPU in the future, so having a little bit of headroom is nice. So I think you could get by with 600 watts or so. But I think, and again, depending on the specific graphics card, but that, like I said, having more than that is nice. Now, I've already looked at this before, but I really like this Montech Century 2 at its current pricing right now. Now, this is slightly a little bit of overkill compared to what you probably could get away with, but I think you're getting a lot for it, and power supplies are one of the things that you could keep for a long time. Now, the other thing, though, with power supplies is if you just sort prices low to high, you could be like, I could spend $32 on a power supply, and I'm getting 550 watts, 650 watts. That could be completely fine. And so let's talk about this for a second. So not all power supplies are created equal, and the power supply is one of the very few components in your PC that could actually just fry your system if something goes wrong. So being a super terrible power supply, not a great idea. That being said, most power supplies these days are unlikely to fry your system, but it's not impossible. Now, so how can you tell how good they are other than the wattage and stuff? Well, there's a PSU power supply, PSU tier list that I'll link in my video description. That's the most up-to-date one I can find. This is SPL's PSU tier list. There used to be a Cultist's tier list that is just hasn't been updated recently. So this has been updated more recently. And if you look at these tabs in the bottom here, we can go to the main list. And the way you should generally use this is you should be looking at a particular power supply, and then you should search for it in that list and check what sort of a tier rating it gets. A is the best, F is avoid, okay? E you should probably also avoid. For a super budget system, a C is not a disaster. A B is even better, and an A is great. Now, so if we look at some of these power supplies here, like this Apevia Captain, it's $32, 550 watts. Maybe we save some budget and go with that if it's well rated. So I'm going to Control F on here, and I'm going to type in Apevia. If we get to Apevia, then you can see that they have all of their lines here. And what we were looking at was the Apevia Captain 550 watt. So if this scores well, let's get it. Oh no, Apevia Captain is F tier. In fact, almost all the Apevia units are F tier or E tier, although it looks like their prestige line isn't too bad. C tier, you might be okay with, but there's a little bit of a warning here that there might be other variants, so it might be hard to tell. So in general, I'm probably thinking, let's stay away from Apevia because I don't want to buy e-waste. Does that make sense, right? Okay, so now let me tell you about the Montech Century 2 that I was mentioning at the beginning, and why I really like that one. So if I go ahead and sorry, I just went all the way back to my went back to the wrong screen here. So power supplies. So let's talk power supplies again. So if I add some filters here. So one thing to talk about is like, what is all this 80 plus stuff? So these are efficiency ratings. They're not quality ratings, they're energy efficiency ratings. So by having a decent energy efficiency, it'll help narrow down some of the junk. That's one thing to think about. But I'm gonna go ahead and just sort for 80 plus bronze, gold, platinum. Those are just getting more and more efficient. And then let's say that I wanted at least 650 watts. Okay, so I'm going to sort for at least 650 watts because that's going to power most mid-range GPUs along with this build. Now I'm going to sort prices low to high. You can definitely see that we got some of these like Apevias and things that we already saw aren't super great. And we're talking like, we're already in like the $55 range. Now, notice that as we scroll down here, again, we're getting, okay, Apevia Prestige, was that the one that we might want to consider? Maybe, so we could maybe get away with something like that. That's already like $67. So we're already pretty up there. Now, if I keep going down, sorting prices low to high, you'll notice that Montech Century 2 is $90. So it's certainly spending a bit more. But notice it's also fully modular. This means that all of the power connectors can disconnect. This helps with cable management. It's 80 plus gold. It's 850 watts. I ran an RTX 4090 on an 850 watt power supply. And if it's paired with a fairly low power AMD CPU, honestly, it'll get by. In other words, an 850 watt power supply is going to be great for future proofing this build for upgrades, which is really nice. But not only that, if we take a look at this, if we look at the Montech Century 2, typed that in wrong, Montech. Now notice that Montech has a wide range of qualities here, right? They've definitely got some C-tier units, but if you look at their Century, and then specifically Century 2, the Century 2 Gold ATX 3.1 power supplies, the 850 watt is listed at A- tier. And the 1,050 and 1,200 watts are listed at A tier. Now, there's still a few like minor notes and things like that, but this is an A- tier power supply. I can be really confident that this is going to be a good power supply. I think it also has a 10-year warranty. So 10-year warranty, good efficiency rating, lots of power, and we're not spending that much more than the complete junk power supplies. That being said, if you are on an absolute budget, you could probably trim $30 off the power supply, and you're going to lose some upgradability and maybe some confidence in the quality of it, but probably still be just fine. So there's definitely some wiggle room on that. I just find that this Montech Century 2 tends to, at least in my opinion, be a really good value part. And if you're talking about parts that you could upgrade, like you could keep these parts for a decade or more and survive multiple upgrades of the rest of your system, the power supply is one of those things that can do that if you buy a good quality one with enough wattage right off the bat. Now, let's kind of put a case in here and then talk about the graphics card. So here's the thing about cases. If we sort price low to high, you can see that you can get them as low as about $40. But if we sort prices high to low, you could spend $2,000 on a case. Okay, so how much makes sense? So the thing is, the case is mostly aesthetic. It needs to actually just physically be large enough to fit your parts. Sometimes there's front panel headers for like USB and things like that. And so it might be good to check that it's like your motherboard that you chose has a front panel header for the right kind of USB that matches your case. Not the end of the world though, because you'll have USB ports on the back of your system on your motherboard anyway. So those are things that you can check on the case. Another thing though is a lot of cases will come with fans built in, and other cases will come without any fans and they expect you to buy your own. Now, buying your own fans can be nice because you can get exactly what you want, but if you buy the case and the fan separately, you're likely spending a lot more money than buying a case that comes with fans. Now, sorting prices low to high, like I said, a lot of these are going to work. However, I find that if you kind of spend just a little bit more, you can get some cases that come with decent fans and still have a really nice modern look. Honestly, a lot of the Montech cases are a good example of that. So that's something to look at. So there's a lot of choices here. So really what I put here is going to be kind of a placeholder, and you're up to kind of choose what makes sense to you. So really, we can slot in a lot of options here. Now, this Montech Air 903 for $65, this is a pretty large case. It should fit everything we need, and it does come with some fans, which is nice. You can see it has a couple of fans in the front, and I think one in the back. And it's about $65. So really, spending more than around $65 is kind of like, you better really just like the look of that case or really want something in particular with that. But I want to be clear that this is just a particular option that I know fits a lot of parts and has decent reviews for value, but there's a ton of other options here, okay? This is kind of a placeholder. But generally, spending more than $100 on a case better be that like you really just care what your PC looks like quite a bit, or you've already maxed out all your performance parts. That's my personal opinion. So let's take a look at where our budget is right now. So right now, you can see that without buying the graphics card, we're already at $642, okay? So if you're thinking about this compared to like a gaming console, like you're a high school student, like just realize that buying a modern PC is gonna be generally more expensive than buying a gaming console. If you want a PC that's more in that kind of price range, I really recommend taking a look. Like I know I already mentioned it, I know this is sponsored, but Jawa, you can find used PCs that are more in line with the pricing of consoles and things like that, rather than when you're buying a new PC, building everything new on a modern platform. It's going to be more expensive, but also, as long as we slot in the right graphics card here, it's going to be more powerful than a gaming console. Also, gaming PCs can do a lot of things consoles can't. And so there's value added there as well, if you care about any of the other things you can do on a PC. So now what we've got to do is figure out the graphics card. So I'm going to be 100% honest here. So I really don't recommend buying any new graphics card that is lower than a 9060 XT 16 gigabyte. Now, I'll mention as well that your price range just might not fit this, in which case there are budget options for graphics cards. But the 9060 XT 16 gigabyte can play any modern game. It's going to be better than the gaming consoles. Because it's on AMD's 9000 series, it has access to FSR 4 upscaling, which is at least close to on par with the newest versions of DLSS, meaning that you can basically, FSR is going to render games at a lower internal resolution than your monitor, but make it look a lot like you're running it at your monitor's native resolution. And FSR 4, unlike the older versions, does a really great job of that, like DLSS. Most people are going to have a hard time really noticing the downgrade by running FSR 4 at reasonable internal resolutions and getting that performance out of it. Also, notice I'm specifying the 16 gigabyte version. There's an 8 gigabyte version that costs a lot less, and it is a lot less, $270. So I would say that if you just absolutely have to cut your budget, I would try to cut almost everything else before I would make this cut. Like I said, buy that less expensive case, buy the less expensive power supply, buy maybe slightly slower RAM, buy that $20 CPU cooler. Try to cut back the budget anywhere else you can. Work for another month, save up for another month. But so there are more budget tier options. And the 8 gigabyte version is plenty fast. And if you're just playing mostly esports games and things like that, honestly, 8 gigabytes won't usually be an issue. But I'd recommend getting the 9060 XT 16 gigabyte version for your minimum GPU choice if you want to be playing the latest games and just not even worry about it. New game comes out, I can play it at very high settings. at decent resolutions and frame rates. So if I slot this in, I'm going to say that this is kind of my like, this makes sense kind of build. And we're at $992. So basically, a modern gaming PC that isn't making huge sacrifices on anything and isn't really overspending on anything should be doable for right about $1,000. Now, there's also operating system. So, I mean, honestly, you can game on Linux pretty well these days, and that's completely free. You can game on Windows without activating it. But if you want to actually activate Windows, you get into those, there's the gray market sites where you can get a really cheap Windows license, which, there's questionable thoughts on how those were obtained and whether they're following the kind of licensing agreement they were supposed to with Microsoft, but generally those work. And then you can buy a legitimate copy, but those are usually like $100 or so. Anyway, so I'm going to leave that out of the price for the PC. Just realize you do need an operating system. But like I said, there are free operating systems out there. Also mentioning, if you do go the Linux route, I'm not saying like total beginner PC user should necessarily do that, but if you do go the Linux route, AMD does tend to be a better choice for GPU, to my knowledge, as far as support in the AMD ecosystem. So there's that. Now, so this system I think makes a lot of sense. So if you have $1,000 to build a gaming PC, I think this is a great choice. And like I said, there's a few places you could shave off the budget. You could even go down to like a 500 gigabyte SSD and just upgrade it again later, right? You could spend a little less on the case, a little less on the power supply, a little bit less on the cooler, maybe even a little bit less on the memory. But this makes a lot of sense. But what if you actually have more money? Where does it make sense to upgrade things? And I'm going to say that, you could upgrade the CPU. The vast majority of games and gaming situations are going to benefit a lot more from upgrading the graphics card up until we start getting to such a fast graphics card that you'll be more likely to be CPU limited. Also, there's the monitor choice. And I would say that for most gaming systems these days, 1440p is going to be a great choice because you can actually use FSR or DLSS to render the game below 1440p, so it'll still perform better than 1080p at native, but look better by outputting something that looks more like a 1440p image. So your monitor choice, I would recommend getting a 1440p monitor with variable refresh rate support, which the vast majority do, and I would say get at least 120 hertz or more. But there's tons of options. They're not super expensive. We don't need to get into the weeds on that. You can look up individual monitor reviews, but that'd be my general recommendation for a monitor. 1440p, variable refresh rate support, that's like FreeSync, G-Sync, and 120 hertz plus, but look up individual monitor reviews to get an idea of how good they are, but they don't need to be that expensive, $150 or so, but you could certainly spend more. So I'm going to leave those out of the price of the build right now, but do consider that. There's also a keyboard and mouse, which you can get really cheap. You might already have, but you could certainly spend the sky's the limit, just like anything else. So if you were going to spend more on this, though, I would say the graphics card is the place to do it. So what's better than the 9060 XT? The 9060 XT 16 gigabyte, NVIDIA's alternative is slightly faster, but their 16 gigabyte version for the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte is $430. So you're certainly spending more. You get a little bit more performance, and you also get NVIDIA's feature set and ecosystem. They tend to get, NVIDIA tends to come out with new features before AMD, and AMD tend to get their version of it at some point. So you're kind of getting into that ecosystem. There's also frame generation, where NVIDIA has a multi-frame generation mode, which honestly isn't that much better than just a × 2 frame gen mode, where AMD has a version of that. So there's some nice to haves for NVIDIA GPUs for sure. You could look more into those differences. So if you had it in your budget, this is also a perfectly good choice. And notice that we are still absolutely within our price range on this. Although suddenly our memory just disappeared off the list. Looks like, guys, people bought that memory probably because it was a good deal. They bought it out from under us, guys. Do we need to slot in new memory now live in the video? That's kind of obnoxious. Anyway, so it looks like I'm just going to go ahead and slot in some memory that is slightly worse than what we had just to have the price in there. So again, it was about $100. So anyway, so we're about this. Again, prices will absolutely fluctuate, which is also why I recommend buying everything kind of all at once rather than buying things like one at a time. But that's a whole other topic. Just because new things come out, prices change. Anyway. So this pushes us a little over $1,000. Now, I would say that let me see if the 5070 is still available for under $500 because it was last time I checked. Because the 5070 starts to be about 30% faster. Now it drops to 12 gigabytes of VRAM, which is annoying. But yeah, there's a version available right now for $500. So this is not that much more, but you're gaining about 30% performance. And if you're talking 1440p or 1080p gaming, 12 gigabytes is still usually just fine. And this still keeps us under $1,200. We're at about $1,150. And this gets us a lot more gaming performance. And I think it's going to last a really long time. Now, again, could you spend more? I would say still at this point, it makes sense to be throwing the money at the graphics card rather than stuff like the CPU. Still makes sense at this point because usually a 7600X is still going to be keeping up with the 5070 just fine. So past this point, there's a couple of AMD options that give you 16 gigabytes of VRAM. Let's check their pricing right now because they've kind of been hit or miss on the pricing. So the 9070 from AMD is a 16 gigabyte card. That's about 10% faster than the 5070. You also start to lose the NVIDIA feature set, which tends to be a little bit nicer to have, but it's not majorly so. And this is going to be another $60. So you're spending a bit more to get the 16 gigabytes of VRAM, about 10% more performance. And then, but again, you're falling out of the NVIDIA ecosystem, so kind of up to you how much you want to value that. But I think these cards, AMD's 9000 series cards are really definitely good stuff. Now you're coming in right at about $1,200, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, if you still have more money to throw at this, I still recommend throwing it at the graphics card. Although I also wouldn't mind upgrading to a 2 terabyte SSD, because by this point we're kind of getting into kind of a little bit of diminishing returns until you spend a lot more. So the 9070 XT version is now going to be another about 10% faster than the 9070 non-XT version was. Still 16 gigabytes of memory, still in the AMD kind of feature set. But this is now $670. So we're spending now $100 more for only about 10% more performance, no extra VRAM. So we're starting to get some kind of diminishing returns here. So that's where I feel like the 5070 and AMD's 9070 non-XT right now are really where some of the value starts to drop off if you go past that point. So I do want to make sure I mention that. So past that point, even getting to this XT version, starting to be a little bit questionable on is the value there. But if you have the budget, it's absolutely still increasing your gaming performance. But again, maybe consider like upgrading the quality on a few of these parts, getting that nicer cooler, getting 2 terabytes SSD storage, a fancier looking case. Maybe you value that more than the 10% extra performance we're getting by getting the XT version and spending that extra $100, right? Maybe that $100 could be better spent on some niceties on the other parts. So that's something to think about. Past the 9070 XT is the 5070 Ti. Now, this is really almost the same performance as the 9070 XT, and they're about $750. So you're spending another almost $100 more to get the same amount of VRAM, almost the same overall performance, other than when you're in heavy ray tracing workloads. That's where the 5070 Ti is a lot better. Than the 9070 XT, but only in like path tracing. In standard ray tracing, it's not even that much faster. Again, you get back into the NVIDIA ecosystem though. So you could do that, and now you had about a $1,400 build. So if that's still within your price range, I think this still can make sense to do. But again, I might have bumped up the SSD and things like that before that. Past this point, I'm just going to say that things really drop off. AMD in the current gen doesn't have anything better than the 9070 XT. NVIDIA does, but you generally pay through the nose to get it, probably because there's no AMD competition at that performance tier. The 5080 is the next step up. That's $1,000, so you're spending $250 more, and you're getting about 15% more performance than that 5070 Ti. that brings it up to a $1,650 build. Now, past this point, the only faster graphics card is the 5090. And I'm just going to say that that wouldn't make sense with this build. Past the 5070 Ti, I think it's going to make sense to start upgrading things like the CPU and things like that. So at that point, if you're already at the 5070 Ti, I would really say, rather than upgrading to the 5080 or the 5090, it's going to make more sense to upgrade other components in the build. And like I said, you might want to get the 2TB SSD, upgrade some of the other parts, but you might also start to target the actual CPU itself. At this point, I might buy a faster CPU. Now, the thing is, you could go up to like an 8-core CPU, like the 7700X. That's like $261. We could check the 9700X from the newer generation, which has similar performance, but that's like $304, and it's not much faster than the 7700X. But let's check the price on the 7800X 3D right now. It's gone up a little bit. These were as low as $320, but I will say that this is going to get you almost the fastest CPU performance really in the world. Almost, not quite, but almost. And it's not that much more expensive than that 7600X or some of those other 8-core parts, but it is a lot faster for gaming. So notice here, we can get the 5070 Ti, we can get the 7800X 3D, and so we have one of the fastest gaming systems you can buy. The only things that would make this faster are going to cost a lot more, and we're still under $1,600 for the build. Now, again, let's look at the CPU reviews, right? You have your 9800X 3D setting the 100% baseline. The 7800X 3D, look at that. It was within like 5% of the performance here. Now, I've seen more recent reviews pushing the gap to more like 10%, but it's really not a huge gap. The 7800X 3D is right there near the top of the charts, even if it isn't the top of the charts. But the 9800X 3D is going to cost a lot more money. I mean, we can double check the pricing right now, but I just don't think, $460 right now. So it's not like $100 more to the build for very little improvement to the performance. So at this point, we're at about $1,600, and the only things you would do to improve performance would be a 9800X3, which is another $100, and you're mostly going to be GPU limited with this CPU, so you're not really going to notice it. Or go up to like a 5080, $250 more for like 15% more performance, and then the 5090. Now the 5090 is not a crazy option with the 7800X 3D, but at that point I would probably go to the 1000-watt version of this power supply, just to be safe, because the 5090 is like a 600-watt part. Anyway. So this video is almost an hour long now, so we should probably just stop. But I really wanted to take the time to explain the thought process behind making all of these choices. Although notice again that maybe this ASRock motherboard, if we're going with the X3D part, maybe at that point, because I had mentioned they had issues, they've had some BIOS updates, which have hopefully fixed it. But if you're going with the X3D part, I would maybe swap off the ASRock motherboard, just since they did have some recent issues with the 9800X 3Ds. So that's kind of another thought on if you're doing that build. But the overall build I was really focused on was, like I said, at about $1,000, you get something that makes a whole heck of a lot of sense. That 7600X, 5070 Ti in here is not out of place. That puts you around $1,400. But then, like I said, I really think that you start to get diminishing returns on value past parts like the 5070 or the 9070 from AMD. So I think a build like this with the 5070 in it makes a whole heck of a lot of sense for $1,150. Or like I said, spend the extra $60 to get the 9070 from AMD. Like I said, don't really like the idea of going much lower than the 9060 XT 16GB. And if you want to go much lower than this, that's where I would say that popping over to maybe just get a full, just a used gaming PC, if your budget's a lot more like the $500 or $600 range, because you're mostly going to be buying out-of-date parts anyway, whereas this is getting you on the latest platform. All right, I should just stop talking. We're at an hour long, guys. Hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting, and I hope that you have an excellent day.